Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked all around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, and fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease."
Welcome to Day One. I'm Bill Turpie. Our radio preacher is Bishop Bevel Jones of the United Methodist Church. His message is entitled, "That None Be Left Out," from Mark chapter 5, verses 21 through 34. In a moment, some reflections on his message and on this passage. But first, here's some short excerpts from Bishop Jones' message.
There are many people today who feel a kind of crowded loneliness. They're out on the margin of society, left out and alienated. I want to talk with you today about the importance of every individual to God. And then comes Jairus, falling at Jesus' feet and begging him repeatedly to come and save his daughter. The scripture says simply, "So he went with him." The late Henry Nouwen, great Catholic teacher, minister, said in the prime of his career he became frustrated by the many interruptions to his work. He was teaching at Notre Dame, and he had a heavy agenda daily and didn't like to be disturbed. Then one day it dawned on him that his interruptions were his work. Someone has said, life is what happens to you while you're making other plans. Often we find, however, that the interruption is of greater consequence than what we were doing.
This passage, of course, is based on this time that Jesus is ministering. I believe it's in Galilee, and this leader of the synagogue, Jairus, comes to him and says, "Please come and help me. My daughter is very sick." And Jesus starts out, and he gets interrupted. But Jesus actually experiences two interruptions here. What about this whole idea? I mean, we like our lives moving on a single path, and interruptions are interruptions.
The big opportunities are often serendipitous, are often unexpected. I read a study this past week that studied people who were perceived as lucky. And they actually did a scientific survey and study, and the people that were luckier in life didn't have different things happen to them. They just paid attention and were able to take advantage of the things that did happen to them.
Maybe it's kind of coming against that whole myth that we are in control. Interruptions to me are a blessed opportunity to realize that life's not in my control, and thank goodness it's not. When I think it is, the times when I've said I'm going to get that job and something has changed, it's always been that I've found later, gosh, I'm glad that my plans didn't work out. So I think it says a lot to us about letting go.
Interruptions have a domino effect, though, and it can be really frustrating for those around us. When we make a decision long ago, I realized that my life is interruptions, that my work is about the interruptions. And that means that I sometimes run late. It means that it can take me a while to answer phone calls or emails because of the interruptions. So there's a downside to that.
So we're talking about balance here, I guess.
I love what this passage says about God. If Jesus is God incarnate and Jesus gets interrupted, then maybe God's not totally in control in the way that we think of as controlling. That God's control is something very different from our very carefully planned day that, heaven forbid, somebody should try to interrupt. The message here is God's responsive, God's available. It's a wonderful, fluid image of God, I think.
It's a wonderful thing, you know, that he all of a sudden says, hey, my interruptions actually are my life, my ministry. And if we can see it that way, certainly our own lives would be turned upside down.
The only way we come to see it that way is when we experience those interruptions, and then we realize at the end of the day, when I look at my to-do list and I say, I've only done 2 things out of 10 on this list, but when I look at the interruptions, I've done a lot.
So maybe a better day is when we don't get to cross off all the to-dos.
Exactly.